Hello. Today we're going to learn about what happened in Europe right after World War I and the period that led up to ultimately World War II. This is oftentimes known as the interwar period. Expands about 20 years, roughly, and historians often comment that ultimately it's this time period and the Treaty of Versailles that was signed after World War I that ultimately lead to all of the issues that caused World War II. So as we go through this discussion today, I want you guys to think about, did the punishment, was it really doled out fairly to the losers of World War I? Do you think that perhaps there could have been a way for World War II to have actually been prevented? And so these are kind of the things that we'll explore. And ultimately at the end of this, I want you to kind of ponder those big questions. So when the First World War ended in 1919, if you recall, a lot of people going into the conflict thought that ultimately, because this was a global conflict and there had been nothing like it at this point in history, that somehow this would be, quote, the war to end all wars. When in fact, we know now, looking through our little crystal ball of history, that ultimately it really was just a precursor to the next major conflict. So as wars typically do, at the end of them, you'll have a treaty. And usually these don't happen right away. You can have a ceasefire, but the actual formal treaty itself doesn't take place until, 6 months, maybe a year later. And that was certainly the case with the Treaty of Versailles. So as you probably guessed, the treaty actually did get signed at Versailles, the Palace of Versailles in France. And ultimately you have four empires that are going to forever be changed as a result of this. You're also going to have some other creation of empires. But probably more importantly, you're going to have the buildup of future hostilities. So before I get to that, let me explain kind of the main goal of the Treaty of Versailles, and that was to basically put Humpty Dumpty back together again. If you think about Europe, it had been devastated because of the conflict. The U.S., by the way, we're barely in the war. I mean, we're there for about a year and a half, but because this war wasn't fought on our land, we don't have a lot of the same issues that Europe is going to have going forward. So by 1919, you had four empires that have crumbled as far as power and control is concerned. Austria-Hungary is no longer going to be Austria-Hungary. The dual monarchy is now going to just be Austria. And we'll get into what happens to Hungary in a second. Germany is going to be economically, socially, and certainly physically, if you look at the landscape, devastated. And so their massive empire will crumble. The Ottoman Empire will, by 1920, cease to exist. It will be known, at least going forward, and up until 2020 ourselves, it'll be known as Turkey. And then Russia, starting in 1917, actually, in the middle of the war, will start to crumble. And of course, you eventually have the Russian Revolution and the introduction of the Bolsheviks and Vladimir Lenin. And of course, that eventually gives way to communism. So these empires that started this conflict, fairly powerful in 1914, have changed quite a bit by 1919. Additionally, the treaty is going to create new states out of this former area we call the Habsburg Empire. So we now have Austria, which is much smaller than when it was Austria-Hungary. You have Czechoslovakia, Poland shows up again, Yugoslavia, and then we have three new Baltic states, and that's Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And if you can't quite picture where those are, they are to kind of the northwestern part of modern-day Russia nowadays. At this treaty, it was kind of an interesting setup because not everybody that you would think should have been invited was actually invited. And that's sad and probably something that should have been done if they wanted to prevent further conflict. So the four major countries that have a presence there are going to be the British, the French, the US, and then the Italians, kind of. So the big discussion was ultimately, what do we do with Germany? These four agreed that Germany was the problem, and the question was, how do you prevent them from doing something like this again? So the British, their prime minister, his kind of famous quote was that he said, we should punish Germany but not destroy it. And he was kind of looking at it like, if you destroy Germany, what potentially is that going to do as far as the power struggle going forward in Europe? The French Prime Minister, Clemenceau, he wanted French security, basically at whatever cost it was to Germany. So his take was more so, let's punish the Germans. His mindset is probably a little bit more of the fact that he does share a border with Germany, and they had pretty quickly threatened France the first time around, and they wanted to prevent that the second time. Our president at the time was Woodrow Wilson. If you guys remember it a little bit from U.S. history, his big push was that he shows up at the Treaty of Versailles meetings and he gives his 14-point speech. And the big thing to come out of that is that ultimately we should have some type of League of Nations. But if you guys also remember from U.S. history, of course, our Congress does not support that idea. So the League of Nations does get created. It's kind of the precursor to the United Nations, but the U.S. does not actually join it. And then the Italian Prime Minister, Orlando, because Italy had kind of switched sides at the last minute before the war started, they really didn't have a huge impact on the conflict itself. And the other big winning sides felt like Italy really didn't do much to help. And so they weren't going to get any of Germany's land. And he actually got really upset because they weren't going to get any of the spoils, if you will. And he went back home. The Russians were invited, but at this point, Vladimir Lenin is in charge, and he supposedly called this gathering a capitalist plot, and that the Russians would not attend. And meanwhile, the country that ultimately should have been at the conference was Germany, and Germany was not invited until the very end of the conference. So when it was all said and done, the results, if you will, of this is that Germany is going to lose 13% of its actual physical land that it owned. On that land was 12% of the population. They had a region that was in kind of the western area known as the Saar region, and that would be placed under control of the League of Nations all the way up until 1935. The eastern border had an area that was Eastern Prussia, and that was given to help recreate Poland. Germany was forced to surrender all of its overseas colonies that it had acquired during the Age of Imperialism. Their army was supposed to be reduced to 100,000. We don't actually know to what extent it was because nobody really kind of oversaw that. They were also supposed to get rid of all their U-boats. And those of you that know a little bit about technology from World War I, the U-boats were basically their submarines. Their air force was eliminated. They had an area along the western part, the Rhine River, between them and basically Belgium and France, that is known as the Rhineland. And that area was supposed to become a demilitarized zone, so there's supposed to be no German military equipment there at all. I'll get to the war guilt thing in just a second. They were forced to pay war reparations, which is basically a fine for causing the war. And that was a bill that basically equated to $33 billion, which was going to be pretty tricky, seeing as Germany's economy had collapsed and some of their areas that had factories were now under the control of the League of Nations. They also were excluded initially from the League of Nations. Now, for all of this to go into effect, however, the Germans were forced to finally show up at the Treaty of Versailles and to sign something called the War Guilt Clause, this thing right down here. And basically it was Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, and it essentially was a document where Germany basically took the blame for World War I. They were coerced into signing it, basically told you sign this or else you'll have bigger issues on your hands. And so they had to sign it. By signing it, though, that also meant that they supposedly conceded to causing the conflict, and because of that, then they had all these punishments. This was an issue that really stung Germans, and most Germans felt as if they were not treated fairly for this conflict, that ultimately they weren't the ones that started it, or they would say things like, well, we might have been the first, but we obviously weren't, the only people that were really kind of riled up and upset at the beginning of the war that there was so much tension and these alliances and all these things that were boiling over, and that they basically were trying to say we didn't start it, in the sense of we aren't to blame. I know it sounds weird, but that's kind of their take on it. So they had to accept total blame for the war. They had to pay reparations. And they, of course, also had to eliminate their Navy and Army, which they never really did. And then the loss of territory, that one stung because you did have 12% of this German population that was no longer technically German. So the map of Europe in 1919, you can kind of see where certain chunks of land go. If you look at the middle, obviously, where we have all this yellow territory, that was actually what was previously Austria-Hungary, but that becomes new countries. And then to the north of that, you see some of those reemergence, like of Poland. And Finland actually didn't have Finland proper again until 1919. And then if you guys look to the Middle East, this is kind of a different thing, too, that we don't always talk about. But the Ottoman Empire, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, actually gave way to the kind of creation of some areas of more independent control. And this is actually when Iraq and then Jordan and Syria and parts of what becomes, of course, Lebanon, and then Palestine, because we don't have Israel yet, it's Palestine. These areas become more independent and are free of Ottoman control. All right, so let's look at what happens to Germany in the time after the Treaty of Versailles up to the buildup of World War II. So if you were living in Germany at the end of the war, you not only, of course, are facing the fact that you have lost the war, and there's a sense of embarrassment and shame in a sense, but the reality is, and you can kind of see this with this German map to the left, all that territory in red, you've lost that. Like, that's been taken away, and your country really didn't have a say in it. And so a lot of Germans hold on to this idea that they have basically been robbed and the international community has kind of screwed them over. And so they vow to supposedly never forget, that they have lost some of their brethren, if you will. When the World War I soldiers came home, if they were unfortunate enough to actually be wounded, there was very few services available to them. They don't have, the veterans programs that we do now. Extremely high unemployment rate. You start to get homelessness. You start to get massive starvation levels throughout Germany. The soldiers themselves felt like the country had kind of given up on them, when in fact, they actually believed, some of them truly believed, that they could have won the war if the government hadn't basically given up in November of 1919. You have these disgruntled World War I vets that come home that really feel like, many of them went off to the war as high school kids and kind of come back as men in their early 20s, and they don't really know what to do. Some of them are pretty disillusioned and pretty upset with not only the Weimar government, which was the government that replaced the Kaiser when he stepped down, but just kind of German society in general, including the guy that you see circled there, Adolf Hitler, who himself was not only in World War I, but was wounded twice in the conflict, one of the great what-ifs in history. But he is going to be very upset with how things were handled, and that's going to sting, and that's going to stay with him. And he is going to find a number of other young men who really feel as if Germany screwed up in a sense of following a government they shouldn't have followed, and he will start to kind of percolate these ideas. Another problem hitting Germany at this time is that you have massive inflation and unemployment. The German mark, which is the name of their currency, became so devalued that because they had this massive inflation, because of this huge depression they had. If you guys look over at this chart on the right-hand side, if you were in Germany, let's say 1914, you would need 4.2 German marks, let's say, to equal $1 US, okay? By the end of the war, in 1919, you were going to need 14, so it was a 14-to-1 conversion rate. Within, you'll notice, 2 years, it's 76. And then by the time we get to 1923, look at how many German marks you would have to physically be carrying to equal $1. And that is an inflation rate that's out of control, which is why it became cheaper for people to burn German marks than it was to buy firewood or just to let your kids play with piles of it at home. Along with that, you'll notice that with this chart, and I know it's a little convoluted, but we start to have high unemployment rates. And that's not only going to be Germany. So in Germany in 1930, they were coming out of kind of their depression basically by the time they get, 1932 is their peak, okay? Meanwhile, Japan has very low unemployment. I mean, that's super impressive. The problem, of course, for the rest of the world is nobody's paying attention to what Japan was doing at this time and how militaristic they were becoming, which is obviously really unfortunate as we know getting closer to World War II. Great Britain will start to sink into a bit of an economic decline as well, particularly by the time you get into 1932 and 33. And meanwhile, in the U.S., our economy, even though the Great Crash, of course, happens in 29, we really don't start to feel the effects until 32 and 33. Now, why I'm showing this to you is that when we start to go into our Great Depression in the 1930s, the middle 1930s, you'll notice that Germany is starting to come out. And that's because right around this time period here, there's a new political party that comes into play. Before we get into that part, please understand that part of the reason why the German economy is so bad after the war is that they start to actually fall behind on their war reparation payments to France. And France, because they hate the Germans and what they did to them in World War I, they decide to basically march troops in to this area known as the Ruhr Valley and take over all the German factories there. It'd be kind of like if for some reason Canada was mad at us and they decided to go in and take over like Pittsburgh, okay, major industrial zone. This just feeds more and more resentment toward the French, and the German people are starting to look for some type of revenge component and how to get back not only at the French, but other pockets of Europe. And, they've destroyed Germany. What's interesting is that the German workers that worked at these factories, they were basically told by the French, you will produce equipment, we are going to sell it, and whatever we make on the profit, we will put towards your bill, basically, what the country owed. So what these German workers did is they basically decided to go on strike, okay? Now, that in itself would have probably been relatively okay, but then to support their own workers, the German government just started printing more money. They're like, hey guys, we know you aren't making anything for us, but we'll just give you some money anyway, which obviously you don't have to be super good at economics to know that that's probably not a good idea. So the government at this time, I gotta get some pictures in here. Many will blame the German government that exists after World War I up until really the 30s. The government it's called the Weimar Republic. It looks like Weimar, but it's pronounced Weimar Republic. They are basically a group of individuals who many in Germany felt were very corrupt, were very weak as far as leadership is concerned. And there's several groups that think they'll be able to overthrow them. One of those groups is actually going to be a group led by Adolf Hitler. And way back in the 20s, he decided to basically attempt to have a coup or an overthrow led by himself and some of his buddies. And the idea was that they were going to basically storm all these beer halls and supposedly storm into these beer halls and basically call for a revolution and an overthrow of the German government, and that they were going to somehow have all this massive following. It's called the Beer Hall Putsch. It did not work. Down here I have a nice little picture that shows him with his sidekicks and some lederhosen. It's going to fail. They will go to prison. While he's in prison, he will write his very famous book, Mein Kampf, which stands for My Struggle, which basically talks about his struggle supposedly as a World War I vet and coming home to a very, kind of disillusioned and disgruntled disillusioned and disgruntled German environment and his plan for the future. He was supposed to be in prison for several years, but apparently he was let out early for good behavior. Another what if in history. So the government that existed in Germany from 1920 to 1933, they have a lot of different political parties. In fact, folks, most countries in Europe have several different political parties, not just like a two-party system, kind of like we do here. But what you'll notice across the top is, okay, it starts in, May of 24, and then you kind of go across, and it basically ends in March of 33. Now, if you were living in Germany in 1924, you had quite a few political parties to choose from. And you'll notice right down here, of course, is that the Nazi Party actually existed already in 1924, but it doesn't have very many delegates. And some years it has even less. But what's interesting is that by the time you get to 1930, it suddenly goes from 2 years previous to having only 12 delegates in their congressional body to suddenly 107. And then 2 years later, it has 230. Has a dip in the next election, which happens about 6 months later. And then all of a sudden, 6 months after that, they're up to 288. Meanwhile, the other parties you can kind of see are diminishing. Why this is pivotal is that this is when Hitler and his cronies, if you will, really start to ramp up their public appearances and their rallies, and they start to garner more and more support. And the thing about German politics, like other areas in European politics, is that the person who is the head of the party with the most delegates gets to have a kind of senior role in the government. And so by the time we get to March of 1933, Hitler has basically got enough support, gotten enough members into the leadership that he becomes Chancellor of Germany. How does he do this? He promises the German people things like jobs, stability, a rebuilding of their industry, a chance to kind of tell the League of Nations where to, shove it, basically. He said, we'll get out of the League of Nations. We're going to stop paying war reparations. I mean, we never agreed to that. Why are we paying these things? He talked about building up the military, kind of did it quietly. But he also said, we lost 12% of our population and 13% of our land. We should be getting that back. And so he's basically telling people, I'm going to make your life better. I'm going to get you out of misery. The current government isn't doing anything for you. And so enough people, of course, buy into that message, which often happens, in elections, and he is able to garner that support. One more thing I should mention, too, before we leave Germany, is that he will become chancellor. And then within a year, and Germany at the time had a chancellor and a president. And their president at the time was a guy named Hindenburg. And Hindenburg is going to end up dead in a short amount of time after Hitler became chancellor. We don't really know from what, but at any rate, because he dies, it will allow Hitler to ascend to a higher position in Germany. And the rest, as most of you guys know, is history. Italy, meanwhile, has a similar story as Germany in the sense that they are having economic despair. They were technically on the winning side of the war, but they were upset about not getting any land from the Treaty of Versailles. They also had really high unemployment. They had a poor economy, a really ineffective government, and ultimately they felt as if they should have a more significant role in a world stage, and that really Europe and the rest of the world weren't taking them very seriously. Their kind of big leader that comes out of this time period is also going to be another World War I vet, and that's Benito Mussolini. Now, Mussolini, previous to World War I, had been a socialist for a time period. He was a newspaper man. He knew how to kind of use propaganda to get your message across. Eventually, he joins the war and kind of becomes disillusioned about how the world was actually kind of operating and moving. And I always kind of find it interesting, too, when I put these pictures together. These are all him. So you kind of see this transition from, down at the bottom here, you have the World War I guy, and then kind of his cool 1920s gangster vibe, apparently. And then this one just kind of scares me a little bit. And this image at the bottom is when he becomes a leader, or as he was nicknamed, Il Duce. Now, how exactly does he do that? It's similar in methodology to Hitler, but he is going to adopt a political idea known as fascism. And fascism, I know it gets thrown a lot around in Twitter nowadays and other things, but what it really is it is a totalitarian government. Okay, it's a type of government that glorifies the state and the nation. Okay, and assigns to the state control over every aspect of life. Now, what does that actually mean? It means that you as an individual are not as important as the country itself, that the country is bigger than the people, and that ultimately whatever is best for the country is what needs to happen. The name actually comes from this little symbol over here. It's called the fasces, which was used back in the day. Roman senators, way back, obviously in the day in ancient Rome, Roman senators would have one of these kind of in their belts, on their toga, if you will. And what it was it was a pile of kind of cylinders. The handle, or like it almost looks like an axe handle, was a bunch of cylinders that were tightly wound, and that was supposed to represent unity. And then you'd have this blade that came out of it, and that represents power or strength. And so that's where the name fascism comes from, that you have this unity within the nation. And then because of that strong unity and basically lack of individuality, you have, of course, a strong sense of power. The group that he will be part of will be known as the Black Shirts, and they will have a major demonstration in 1922 called the March on Rome, which you kind of see the picture there. They will ultimately kind of weasel their way, if you will, into Italian politics, similar to how the Nazis will do that. They will start to garner more and more support within the political government, to the point where eventually they will get enough delegates that they will be able to take over control. And with their control, of course, comes Mussolini. It doesn't hurt, obviously, that Mussolini had some of his opposition killed. So it's, easy to win elections when you don't have opponents. He will basically introduce the idea of trying to get the youth involved in his movement. And so he will have, a fascist youth group. I know oftentimes of Hitler Youth and things like that, but Mussolini's actually going to be starting some of these ideas sooner. So when we kind of look at this, and of course I could go on, but trying to keep this relatively brief, we look at why Hitler and Mussolini, like why do people fall for individuals like that? And that's always kind of been one of the great mysteries in history. Both of these men, they offer their countries hope. They give them the promise that they're going to have stability and wealth. In the case of Hitler, it's the idea that you're going to have revenge for the Treaty of Versailles. The reality is, too, jobs get better in Germany, and they get stronger because of Hitler. And Mussolini gets things, I know it sounds silly, like the trains running on time in Italy. Like that was a huge thing. He makes this campaign promise, and then it happens, and it vastly improves people's lives. And people are like, yeah, like this guy gets things done. And so people get really caught up in the idea that things are getting better, and they get caught up in nationalist fervor. You have the Italian flags flying everywhere and the German flags, and everyone's excited to be Italian and to be German again. And they hadn't had that for a couple of decades. And really people get so caught up into this kind of mania, they don't realize until it's too late that they're in trouble, and that perhaps they've given up too much to men like Mussolini and Hitler. So I leave you kind of with this cartoon on the right. It's called The New Napoleons. It shows actually Joseph Stalin in the top left, and then you got Mussolini in the back and Hitler in the right. And then in the front you have a guy named Francisco Franco, who is actually going to end up being the dictator of Spain, and Hitler and Mussolini have a kind of hand in that as well, but that's a talk for a different day.